Sing to me, oh Muse. The Odyssey, an original adaptation written and retold for you by Jon Buckeridge. Chapter 5. Lotus Fruit. The great hall at Phaeacia was utterly silent as the crowd stared at Odysseus open-mouthed. Eventually, Queen Arete recovered herself and stood.
"King Odysseus, forgive us our ignorance. We had no idea it was you. Tell us how you came to our island of Phaeacia, and where have you been since the great war in Troy?"
Odysseus turned slowly, and thinking of the last 10 years, it was like a great weight landed on his shoulders. But perhaps it was time to tell the whole story of his travels. Looking up to meet the kindly queen's eyes, he let out a sigh and began. "For the last 7 years, I have been held on the island of Calypso. She first made me her guest, and then made me her prisoner. I was only set free by the machinations of the gods this week. Apparently someone up there on Olympus likes me. I sailed smoothly for a few days, but was caught up in a storm and shipwrecked here. You could say the Lord Poseidon and I don't really see eye to eye." He laughed awkwardly. "You'll understand that joke later. After the war in Troy was finished, our Ithacan fleet loaded up our ships and set off for home. We were young, we were triumphant, and we thought the gods themselves couldn't touch us. We were about to learn just how wrong we were." And Odysseus blinked back tears as he began to recall the saga that had stolen the last 10 years of his life. Odysseus's 12 ships had left the ports of Troy, and immediately an ill wind blew them off course. When it finally passed, they pulled in at a port called Ismarus. As soon as they landed there and saw the rich town all calm and quiet, Odysseus and his Ithacans, still drunk on battle fever with Troy so fresh behind them, leapt from their boats and charged into the town, looting, burning, and pillaging. Gradually, as the haze of bloodlust began to clear, Odysseus looked around at his men and was filled with regret. This wasn't battle, this wasn't warfare. The people of Ismarus didn't have topless walls to withstand a mighty army. They were simple people just trying to live their lives. Striding forwards, he began to round up his men. "Back to the ships!" he yelled. "Back to the ships, Ithacans!" Grabbing one of his men by his shoulder, he span him round to see he had one hand full of jewels and the other full of a half-empty wineskin. He held the treasure up in front of Odysseus. "I'm gonna buy myself a palace with this when we get home," he announced, "and it'll be grander than even yours, sir." He belched richly, and Odysseus was treated to an intimate knowledge of all the meals he had eaten for the last few days. "But you needn't worry that I'll forget you, sir," the man went on. "I'm gonna buy you a nice new..." Odysseus never found out what he was going to be brought by the man, because at that moment an arrow burst through his neck and out of the other side. Leaping back, Odysseus scanned the horizon and saw a small force of men on the high ground above the town. Looking round, he saw another force, and another, and another. Maybe the town of Ismarus wasn't so helpless after all, because the Ithacans were surrounded now, and while men on the hills began firing down arrows, another much larger group of men on horseback came charging towards Odysseus and his men, spear points gleaming. "Back to the ships!" Odysseus yelled again, but this time it wasn't an idle command, but an urgent, desperate warning. Grabbing men as he passed them, he hauled them backwards towards the sea, knocking treasure from their hands and telling them to grab weapons. "Defend yourselves! We're under attack!" Gradually, the message began to sink in, and the Ithacans grabbed their weapons. "Shield wall!" yelled Odysseus, and the war dogs of Ithaca formed ranks with their shields all around them. Slowly, steadily, they began to pace back towards the ships, but the riders were on them now, and with each pass they made, Ithacans died. What followed was a bloody, urgent skirmish, and by the time they made it back to the ships, the Ithacan fleet had lost 80 men. 80 men lost to greed and lust and foolishness. 80 men who would never see their homes again. As his ships cut through the water, Odysseus swore to Athena herself goddess of warfare and wisdom, that he would never let bloodlust make him that reckless again, would never let his confidence outweigh his caution. They sailed on in peace for a day and a night. When morning broke, they looked for a sign of land. Sighting an island, Odysseus's fleet of ships pulled onto the beach, and he called his men together. Remembering Ismarus and his oath to Athena, he decided caution was the best course. "Right," he said to his men. "We need to scout out what's around. You, and you." He pointed to 3 of his soldiers. "Get out there and see if you can find any sign of people or supplies. And no pillaging, you hear me? In fact, no fighting of any kind unless you're under attack." The men gave their word and set out to see where they were. Odysseus and the rest of the men set up a camp and waited on the beach for news. After a few hours, they began to get a bit bored, and some of the men went for a swim. Some others started digging a great big hole, as men will always do when they're left alone on a beach. Some found a picnic blanket from somewhere and started serving up little honey cakes. It was all quite civilized, but by nightfall there was no sign of his men, and Odysseus was starting to feel nervous. "They might have just found shelter for the night, sir," suggested Eurylochus, one of Odysseus's men. "Let's wait till daybreak, and if they're not back, then we'll go looking for them." This seemed sensible to Odysseus, and they bedded down to rest. When morning came, though, there was no sign of his men. "Eurylochus," he called, "you're in charge till I get back." And he strode off towards the centre of the island, following his men's tracks. He didn't have to walk far before he came across a nearby town, but it didn't look much like any town Odysseus had ever visited. No one was on guard. There were no traders in the street. No one seemed to be doing anything. The whole town was deathly quiet, and everything seemed caked and layered in dirt and grime and rubbish. Cautiously, Odysseus stepped through the silent streets searching for signs of people. And he found them. There were hundreds of them, all huddled together and laying out on top of one another. Some of them seemed to be sleeping, some of them lay too still for even that, and some of them sat hunched with their eyes wide open, rocking gently from side to side and humming to themselves. As Odysseus got closer, he saw that they all looked filthy and unwashed, and none of them seemed to notice or care. Odysseus certainly noticed, though, when he got close enough to smell them, and the stench of hundreds of unwashed bodies hit him like a wave. He turned aside to gag, and as he did, he noticed that all around the people, stacked up against the walls and in baskets and wrapped up in leaves, were piles of a green-white fruit. As he watched, he noticed people scampering back and forth to grab the fruit, shove it in their mouths, and fall back into their twitching slump. "What in the name of almighty Zeus is going on here?" he said. He hadn't really expected an answer, but at that moment a hand was thrust up towards him with the green-white fruit clutched proudly in the palm. "Lotus," offered a voice. "It's good." Seeing the face attached to the hand, Odysseus realized with a shock that it was one of his own men, and slumped next to him were the other 2 he had sent. "Perimedes?" asked Odysseus. "Perimedes, it's me, Odysseus. What happened to you?" "What?" the man replied. "Odysseus?" He seemed half lost for a moment, as if he was grasping for something just out of reach. "It's me, Perimedes, Odysseus." He grabbed the man by his shoulders. "We need to get out of here. We need to get back to Ithaca." "Where?" mumbled Perimedes. A look of confusion passed over his eyes, and then it was gone, and a blissful peace replaced it, and he held up the green-white fruit again. "Lotus," he offered. "It's good." Odysseus stared in horror. Whatever this was, it was not good. "Right," he said with determination, and grabbing his men by the scruff of their necks, he began to drag them back to the ships. No, yelled Perimedes. "I want Lotus." Gradually, Odysseus hauled the men, kicking and screaming and whining back to the ships. "Eurylochus," he called, "get the men together, we're leaving, and nobody is to eat anything from this island." Hauling Perimedes and the 2 wretched men on board, he tied them to the ship's mast and forced water down their throats as the Ithacans set sail once again.
"And did the men recover?"
asked Queen Arete. Odysseus shook himself from his memories and looked around at the hall of the Phaeacians, all hanging on his every word. "They did, my lady," he replied. It took a few days, but eventually they recovered their wits. I don't know what that Lotus was, but to make a man forget his family and his home so quickly. He faded into silence, as his mind turned to his own home of Ithaca and his beloved Penelope and the son he had left who must by now be a man. Soon, he promised himself. I'll be home soon. He didn't know it, but hundreds of miles away on the island of Ithaca, Penelope was looking out over the sea and thinking the same thing about her husband and son. Soon, the queen whispered to them. Come home soon. Checking her hair, setting her shoulders, and schooling her face to calm, Penelope stepped out onto her balcony overlooking the great hall. The suitors fell silent as they looked up at her. One by one the men gasped and gaped as they goggled at her. But she couldn't help but notice that fewer of them looked than they had done when they had first arrived. Before, she had been able to command their attention without a word. Now, fewer and fewer of them gave her time of day. I'm losing them, she thought. I'm losing their attention. If she didn't have their attention, she didn't have their respect, and without that, she had less than nothing. Show no weakness, she told herself in the safety of her mind. Show them nothing. Keeping her face perfectly still, she gave a gentle nod, and the hubbub of eating and drinking and raucous laughter filled the air again. Looking out across the hall, Penelope mourned once again for the time she had lost with Odysseus and her son, the family they might have been, the laughs, the loves, even the blazing rows they might have had. She was so lost in her thoughts that she almost missed two men gathered together. Where everyone else was eating and drinking and laughing, these two men sat with their heads close together, and not so much as a smile crossed their faces. Every now and then their eyes would flicker up to her and then hurriedly back to their huddle. That wants watching, said Penelope to herself. I don't like the look of that at all. It looks like trouble. She did not know how right she was.